The Voxari diplomat smirked as he mocked humanity's primitive technology at the Galactic Trade Summit, drawing cruel laughter from the alien crowd. But he didn't realize his arrogance would be the greatest regret of his life when humans made the Voxari pay in blood. Gerald Scorer, a grizzled human cargo pilot ferrying a shipment from Earth to Polaris, clenched his jaw as he watched footage of the incident on the news. He was sick of it. Sick of condescending Voxari and their puffed-up ambassador Tyro belittling humans as backward savages on the fringes of civilized space. Sick of humanity being the galaxy's punching bag. "They think our ships are junk heaps. Think we're dumb upstart apes, no threat," Gerald muttered, hands tightening on the flight controls. "But we'll show them what insignificant humans can do." For decades, the Voxari Dominion and other alien empires had kicked sand in humanity's face. They mocked mankind's quaint colonies and puny space navy, but they didn't know humans were catching up in secret, stealing alien tech and building weapons. Big weapons. A war was coming. Gerald could feel it in his bones. Humanity was a slumbering giant about to be rudely awakened, and God help whoever did the waking. The comm crackled with an emergency broadcast. Unprovoked Voxari attack, dozens of frontier settlements burning, casualty reports still coming in. Gerald's blood ran cold. So it begins, he thought grimly, firing up his ship's engines. Time to teach some soon-to-be-sorry aliens why it's a bad idea to fuck with the human race. Looks like laughing at mankind would be the Voxari's last mistake. Gerald furiously punched in the coordinates for New Horizon Colony as soon as the distress call came through. His cargo ship's engines screamed as he redlined them, pushing the reactor to its absolute limit. Fuck the safety restrictions. The scene that greeted him as he dropped out of warp was utter devastation. The orbital defense platforms were blasted apart, nothing but twisted metal and frozen corpses. Voxari warships hung in space, unleashing a relentless orbital bombardment on the colony below. Bright flashes lit up the dark side of the planet, cities being reduced to molten craters. A choked transmission came over comms. "This is New Horizon. We're being overrun. They're executing everyone. Don't send hell." The signal cut off in a burst of static. Gerald saw red. He hailed the handful of intact human fighters on a secure channel. "Pilots, this is Captain Scorer. Form up on me. We're going to hit those Voxari bastards with everything we've got." "Sir, we're outmatched. It's suicide," one of the pilots protested. "The colonists are dead anyway if we don't act. Now who's with me?" A few tense moments passed before the pilots responded. "We're with you, Captain. Let's make these sons of bitches pay." Gerald armed his ship's twin plasma torpedo launchers and accelerated towards the Voxari flagship. "All craft attack pattern Omega. Concentrate fire on the command ship Calax." Lances of searing light flashed past Gerald's cockpit as the flagship's point defense grid targeted the incoming human fighters. One by one, the overmatched pilots were picked off, ships exploding into brief nebulas of molten metal and vaporized alloy. Gerald gritted his teeth as his ship shuddered under the onslaught. Alarms wailed as his shields failed. He narrowed his eyes, hands flying over the weapons console. His fingers jabbed the launch key. "Eat this, you alien fucks!" Twin plasma torpedoes erupted from the launch tubes, corkscrewing wildly as they homed in on the Calax's engines. The flagship's aft section vanished in a blinding flash as the torpedoes found their mark. Secondary explosions rippled through the mighty warship's hull. Gerald's moment of triumph was short-lived. A lucky shot from the Calax's flank cannon sheared off his starboard engine nacelle. The dying ship spun out of control, trailing smoke and debris as it careened towards the crippled flagship. So this is how it ends, Gerald thought, aiming the nose of his ship at the Calax's bridge. He closed his eyes, bracing for impact. But the killing blow never came. Sudden, blinding light seared Gerald's retinas. His eyes flew open to a view screen filled with a storm of blinding flashes. Arriving human reinforcements tore out of warp, a swarm of deadly strike craft and lethal frigates that fell upon the shocked Voxari like wolves among sheep. The human armada surged forward, their ships bristling with weapons. Swarms of glinting attack drones poured from launch bays and rocketed towards the Voxari fleet. Guided missiles roared from tubes, blazing white contrails stitching the void. The human weapons slammed into Voxari shields and hulls, explosions flaring like small suns. The Voxari ships reeled under the onslaught. Alarms wailed as their defenses crumbled. Shields flickered and died. Drones ripped into exposed decks and vital systems. The Voxari crews scrambled in growing panic and confusion. "The humans! They have negated our cloaking devices. Our shields are failing," a Voxari officer shouted. "Impossible! How could they have cracked our technology?" another yelled. But the humans had done just that. For years, their spies had infiltrated Voxari shipyards and research bases, stealing the secrets of advanced alien tech. Now that knowledge was being put to devastating use. On the bridge of the HFS Retribution, Admiral Hawkins stood resolute. He opened a comm channel to the crippled Kallax. "This is Admiral Hawkins of the Terran Fleet. Voxari flagship Kallax, you are beaten. Surrender now." The screen flickered to life, revealing the ashen face of Ambassador Tyro. He snarled defiantly even as his bridge burned behind him. "We will never surrender to you primitive apes." Hawkins' eyes narrowed coldly. He nodded to an officer. "Show him." The view screen shifted to a tactical display. Tyro's eyes widened in horror. A wing of human stealth bombers had slipped past the Kallax, exploiting holes torn in its defenses. They were arrowing towards a glowing red dot, the Voxari homeworld. Tyro's arrogance crumbled, replaced by naked fear. The humans had played him, baiting the bulk of the Voxari fleet into overextending to New Horizon. Their homeworld was virtually undefended, naked before the human strike. "Wait," Tyro's voice cracked. "A ceasefire! We agreed to a ceasefire!" Hawkins nodded grimly as the signal cut out. Gerald watched from his crippled ship as human boarding shuttles darted towards the Kallax. Marines in powered armor swarmed onto the Voxari flagship, storming its corridors and seizing control. Tyro and his officers were bound and dragged away under armed guard. The once haughty Voxari sagged in utter defeat, all fight gone out of them. Cheers erupted across human comms as the news spread. For the first time in galactic history, the mighty Voxari war machine had been broken, not by the ancient powers of the galactic core, but by the upstart race they had mocked and insulted, humanity, the underdogs, the primitive apes. Gerald allowed himself a tight smile even as his ship drifted powerless. Through the pain of broken bones and blood loss, a thought blazed bright and fierce in his mind. Humans had just fired the first shot in a war that would reshape the galaxy, and now the arrogant aliens who looked down on mankind would learn what it meant to face the fury of the human race. Gerald stumbled through the wreckage of New Horizon's once bustling capital, now a blasted hellscape of scorched rubble and twisted metal. The acrid stench of burnt plastic and charred flesh assaulted his nostrils. Smoke stung his eyes. He blinked away tears, unsure if they were from the haze or the horrific scenes seared into his mind. Everywhere he looked, grim-faced soldiers and shell-shocked civilians picked through the ruins searching for survivors. But there were precious few to be found. The Voxari had been thorough in their butchery. A woman's anguished wail pierced the air as she cradled a small, lifeless form in her arms. Gerald looked away, his heart wrenching. How many more had died because he'd arrived too late? He forced himself to keep moving, joining the rescue teams as they dug through collapsed buildings and pried open smoldering vehicles. The sheer scale of death was staggering. Thousands had perished in the Voxari's merciless assault. "Captain Scorer," a voice called out. Gerald turned to see a young lieutenant hurrying towards him, her face streaked with soot and blood. "Admiral Hawkins has called an emergency briefing. All senior officers are to report to the Retribution immediately." Gerald nodded grimly. "Lead the way." The briefing room aboard the Retribution was somber, as Gerald filed in with the other officers. Admiral Hawkins stood at the head of the table, his face etched with weariness and grim resolve. "The butcher's bill is high," Hawkins said without preamble. "Preliminary reports indicate over 3,000 civilians dead, with twice as many wounded. More than half our ground forces were wiped out before the fleet arrived." A murmur of shock and anger rippled through the room. Gerald clenched his fists, barely containing his rage. "What's our next move, sir?" a grizzled colonel asked. "We can't let those Voxari bastards get away with this." Hawkins activated a holo display, bathing the room in ghostly blue light. "Intelligence suggests the Voxari are already preparing a massive counter-offensive. They're marshalling their reserves and calling in favors from their allies. We can expect a full-scale attack within weeks." The Admiral zoomed in on a star map, highlighting key systems. "Meanwhile, the Zorgons and Quiltak are massing ships on our borders. They fear our victory here will embolden us to expand our territory. We must act quickly to keep them off balance." Hawkins outlined his plan, a series of lightning raids and surgical strikes to sow chaos and confusion among the enemy, buying time for humanity to fortify its defenses. But even as he spoke, Gerald could hear the unspoken truth in his words. A long, brutal war awaited them, a war that would likely span years, if not decades. As the meeting drew to a close, Gerald found himself staring out the viewport at the sea of stars. The euphoria of their hard-won victory had faded, replaced by a profound sense of unease. Humanity had finally proven itself a force to be reckoned with. But at what cost? He watched as Voxari prisoners were marched across the hangar bay in chains, their once haughty bearing replaced by sullen defeat. Would the other races of the galaxy ever truly accept humans as equals? Or were they doomed to fight and bleed for their place among the stars for generations to come? The dream of a bright future, of a human renaissance in the cosmos, now seemed impossibly distant. An endless war loomed on the horizon, casting its long shadow over all their hopes and ambitions. The briefing room aboard the Retribution was crowded and tense as Admiral Hawkins addressed his senior officers. "I've just received a coded transmission from the Voxari homeworld. It appears a coup has taken place. The hardliners have been overthrown by a rebel faction led by Tyro's own brother, Zaxar." Gerald frowned, leaning forward. "What does this mean for us, for the war?" "Zaxar is suing for peace," Hawkins said grimly. "He's requesting a secret meeting to discuss an alliance against a mutual enemy, the Zorgons." The room erupted in heated debate. "It's a trap. We can't trust the Voxari. What choice do we have? We're already fighting on too many fronts." Hawkins slammed his fist on the table, silencing the clamor. "Enough. I've made my decision. We will hear Zaxar out." He turned to Gerald. "Captain Scorer, you'll accompany me to the rendezvous as my senior aide and tactical advisor." Gerald stiffened with surprise. "Yes, sir." As the meeting broke up, Gerald caught Hawkins' arm. "Admiral, are you sure about this? The Voxari just slaughtered thousands of our people." Hawkins' eyes were hard. "I don't like it any more than you, but if there's even a chance to end this war before we're all bled dry, I have to take it." The journey to the meeting point was tense, every sensor straining for signs of treachery. As Gerald stepped onto the windswept plateau chosen for the parley, his hand never strayed far from his sidearm. A single Voxari shuttle landed opposite the human delegation. Zaxar emerged, flanked by a cadre of guards. Without his brother's sneer of superiority, he seemed smaller, wearier. "Admiral Hawkins, thank you for agreeing to this meeting. I know there is much blood and bitter history between our peoples." "You'll forgive me if I skip the pleasantries," Hawkins growled. "What do you want?" "An end to this senseless conflict," Zaxar said solemnly. "The Zorgons have been manipulating us all, stoking our fears and prejudices for their own gain. If we continue on this path, we will annihilate each other while they watch and profit." "Even if I believed you," Hawkins said skeptically, "what do you propose?" "A joint strike on the heart of the Zorgon Empire. Cut off the head, and their hold over the younger races will crumble. Only together do we stand a chance." Hawkins glanced at Gerald, who gave a subtle nod. The Admiral turned back to Zaxa. "We'll need to discuss specifics too, but I'm listening." Over the next weeks, an uneasy alliance took shape. Gerald led a hand-picked team on infiltration and sabotage missions deep in Zorgan space, guided by Voxari intelligence. Power stations exploded, supply depots burned, and shipyards crumbled. Zaxar proved true to his word, rallying Voxari and vassal species alike to the cause with impassioned speeches and fiery rhetoric. As fleets mustered and armies gathered, a sense of heady anticipation gripped the galaxy. And then it began. In the skies above the Zorgon homeworld, rebel ships flashed out of warp, weapons blazing. The Zorgons, caught off guard, rallied swiftly, their defense platforms and battle stations lit up, unleashing storms of fire. On the bridge of his assault frigate, Gerald gritted his teeth as a volley of plasma shells hammered his shields. Damage reports flooded in, casualty lists scrolling with grim speed. This was a battle like no other, fast, brutal, unforgiving. "Their right flank is folding," Zaxar's voice crackled over the comm from his own battered cruiser. "All ships, press the attack." And then the retribution was there, a leviathan of battle steel, Hawkins standing tall on its command deck. Its batteries spoke, and Zorgan ships shattered and burned. But the Zorgans were far from beaten. Fresh warships held in reserve roared into the fray. The rebel advance slowed, stalled, as the Zorgans' superior numbers began to tell. "We're not going to make it," Gerald realized with sinking dread. "We need a miracle." As if in answer, a second wave of ships dropped out of warp. Voxari, Quiltac, Zorian, and a dozen other races, all united under Zaxar's banner. They slammed into the Zorgon rear like a thunderbolt. Caught between the hammer and anvil, the Zorgans broke. Gerald watched in awe as their mighty flagship, the inexorable Will, shuddered under a storm of fire and began to break apart. "All ships, move in, finish them!" Zaxar yelled in triumph. And then his voice cut off in a burst of static. Gerald watched in horror as a lucky shot from a dying Zorgon destroyer pierced the Voxari rebel ship from stem to stern. It exploded in a nova of plasma. "Zaxar is gone," he reported numbly. "The flagship—" "Wait, Admiral, your orders?" Silence, and then a strangled gasp over the comm. "Admiral Hawkins is dead," a bridge officer reported, his voice shaking. A Zorgon boarding party, they reached the Retribution's CIC. For a moment, the rebel fleet wavered, stunned by the sudden loss of their leaders. The Zorgons, sensing weakness, hurled themselves forward in a final, desperate charge. Gerald stared at the tactical display, the weight of command settling heavily on his shoulders. He drew a deep breath. "This is Captain Scorer. I am assuming fleet command. All ships form up on me. We will not let their sacrifices be in vain. We will end this, here and now, for all our futures." A ragged cheer went up as the rebel ships surged to meet the Zorgan charge head-on. Laser batteries and torpedo tubes flared, missiles and shells crisscrossing the void. Ships died in flames on both sides, but the rebels' grim resolve never wavered. And then it was over. The last Zorgan ship flickered and went dark, escape pods jettisoning like spores. A stunned silence fell over the rebel comms, broken only by the crackle of static. They had won, but the cost. In the days that followed, as the fires of battle cooled and the dead were tallied, the true scope of the Pyrrhic victory became clear. The galaxy lay in ruins, its worlds and peoples shattered by the long years of total war. As the highest-ranking officer left, it fell to Gerald to take up the heavy mantle of leadership. He looked out over the sea of weary, battered faces, human and Voxari, Quiltac and Zorian, all united by shared grief and fragile hope. "The war is over," he said heavily. "But the hard part, the long part, that's just beginning. We've bought a chance for peace with the blood of heroes. Now we have to build it, day by day, choice by choice. It won't be easy. There will be stumbles and setbacks, but we can't let the sacrifices of those who brought us this far be for nothing. He met their eyes one by one, unflinching. I won't lie to you. The road ahead is going to be long and hard. There's so much to rebuild, so much to heal. But I believe we can do it if we stand together. Not as separate races, but as citizens of one galaxy. That's the future Admiral Hawkins and Zaxxar gave their lives for. That's the future we have to build. As he stepped down from the podium, the assembled beings began to applaud. Slowly at first, then rising to a thunderous ovation. Humans and Voxari, once bitter enemies, embraced each other, tears streaming down their faces. Gerald watched them, feeling a flicker of something he'd thought lost forever: hope. The war was won, but the struggle for a lasting peace was just beginning. And though the path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty, one thing was clear. They would walk it together, one step at a time, into a brighter tomorrow. If you finished this story, please subscribe and like the video. Then leave a comment that says, "I liked the story," and I will heart every single one of them. It really helps me. Thank you for your time.